Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam and this week we are going off-piste and moving away from records and looking at guitarists. So we're going to look at my top 10 guitarists. Now, a couple of things to bear in mind before we get going. First of all, I'm not going to look at anyone who's exclusively jazz or blues or folk or metal. This is a rock show. And the other thing is that this is by no means a list of the 10 greatest guitar players. Such a list would be just ridiculous, as I'm sure you'd agree. There's no such thing as a greatest guitar player. It's a list of my 10 favourite players. Now, why you should be interested in my 10 favourite players, I don't have a good answer for you. Other than that, hopefully, you can think of infinitely worse ways of spending the next 10 to 15 minutes. So grab yourself a cookie or a biscuit, depending on where you're watching from, and a cup of tea, and let's get into it. So at number 10, Lindsey Buckingham from Fleetwood Mac. Now, Lindsey Buckingham is, of course, also a singer, an arranger, a producer, a songwriter, and I think all those other skills really inform his guitar playing because as much as anybody, everything he does on the guitar is to serve the song. He's not about being a guitar hero. He's very good at layering guitars and arranging guitars in a very subtle way just to make the song sound better. He's got a lovely sense of drama as well in the way he does things. You can hear that on Gold Dust Woman and The Chain. His solos are very simple but effective. Listen to his two-note solo on The Chain just after the bass break. But it's all about the song with Lindsey Buckingham. His solo stuff is also very, very good. He's got a really idiosyncratic, interesting approach to producing guitars. He likes to speed them up. He'll do all sorts of things just to make them sound really, really interesting. And I like that experimental approach. He's a very good acoustic guitar player too. Obviously, you can hear that on Never Going Back Again, and also on the brilliant live version of Big Love he does, which again shows you that real sense of drama. But I think he's a really interesting guitar player when he does his solo stuff, and I love the way that his approach to guitar playing is all about the song and the very simple, subtle arrangements that he does. And number 9, putting Jimi Hendrix. Now, you might think this is a little bit low for Jimi Hendrix. I mean, he needs no introduction from me at all. He exploded on the scene in 1967. He had the hair, he had the jacket, the look, the show. It must have been quite a sight. But Jimi Hendrix had, he could play the guitar up behind his head, he could play it behind his back, between his legs, he could probably even play it in his sleep if he'd wanted to. He had enormous hands, so he could do this fantastic sort of funky bluesy stuff with his thumb playing the bass notes. And he could play very, very poetically. You can hear that on the intro to Little Wing, or he could be explosive. You listen to Voodoo Child. I think for me his tone was sometimes a bit abrasive, only you have to sort of whisper that and say it quite quietly because you can't say too much against Jimi Hendrix in the guitar community. Look, I love his playing. I absolutely love his playing, and I love his music. But I think in context, there are just other players on this list who I prefer to listen to on a more regular basis. Number 8, Pete Townsend from The Who. Now, I really wanted to have a great rhythm guitar player on this list, and Pete Townsend is a brilliant rhythm guitar player. When I think of Pete Townsend, I think of those amazing crashing chords on his Telly or his Les Paul. And he was brilliant at playing these crashing chords and then little guitar lines and runs just to move the song forward. I get the impression with Pete Townsend that every single chord counts, and I love that. There's never any holding back. Everything means something when he's putting his guitar lines together. I think he's a very underrated solo player as well. I think he was classically trained. And you can hear that little influences on things all peppered through The Who's music. But a great example of Pete Townsend, his very best, is that wonderful sense of drama he has on the intro to Pinball Wizard, and then suddenly crashes in with that iconic guitar line. But a wonderful songwriter, really interesting songwriter. And again, I think it really helps a lot of these players who are songwriters in their guitar playing. It helps the way they construct their guitar lines and the things they put together. Number 7, Brian May. Now, Brian May from Queen is also an astrophysicist. He is a conservationist. He's written books. He gives lectures. He does all sorts of things, Brian May. He's a real polymath. And that intelligence really, really comes through in his guitar playing. You can hear it because I think, unlike a lot of the players, guitar players, he hates playing pentatonics, lazy boxes and scales that we can all fall into and fall back on from time to time. You get the impression with Brian May that he really sings the melodies to his guitar lines in his head before he puts them down. You can hear that most obviously on something like Killer Queen or on the Bohemian Rhapsody solo. He's brilliant at crafting guitars. You can hear the guitar layering that he did very early on in Queen's career, and he's also revolutionized the way a lot of players use delay pedals. You can hear that on Brighton Rock. One of the things I really love about Brian May is I think more than almost any other guitarist, he's got a foot in the pop camp and the rock camp, so he can really rock out, like on Now I'm Here or Tie Your Mother Down, but at the same time he can play these brilliant pop solos. Listen to the solo on A Kind of Magic, or the heartbreaking solo on These Are the Days of Our Lives. So I love that about him. I think, you know, he has an absolutely wonderful grasp of pop sensibility, and he loves to rock out as well. Hugely influential player. I think there was a time when it was thought, maybe, you know, in the 80s, that he didn't play with a great deal of feel, and, you know, patently that's absolute nonsense. You listen to it now and you can hear that, you know, there's tremendous feel in a lot of the things he does. Number 6, Richard Thompson. Richard Thompson from Fairport Convention is known as the godfather of English folk rock. He started his career with Fairport, and then he went on to a spectacularly unsuccessful solo career. Only if you judge it in sales. If you judge these things by artistry and craft, then I think it was very, very successful. Richard Thompson's guitar playing owes nothing to the blues and American music at all, unlike, again, so many other players. His playing is intrinsically English, and he uses a lot of very exotic and interesting scales. He's a spectacular acoustic guitar player. Listen to something like Vincent Black Lightning or something like Beeswing. But also, he's a wonderful rhythm guitar player, or you know, you can listen to Who Knows Where the Time Goes and hear how interestingly he moves the song along with his lines in that. But also, his solos are absolutely dizzying. You simply don't know what note he's going to play next because he's using all these exotic scales. And you find yourself almost drunk on these solos as he builds them up and builds them up and builds them up to these tremendous crescendos. Again, another fantastic songwriter, and I think that comes out in the way he puts his guitar lines together. But not necessarily as well known as other players on this list, but a spectacular guitar player, well worth checking out if you don't know too much about him already. Number 5, Neil Young. Neil Young, of course, is much more famous as a singer-songwriter. But what I love about Neil Young is that it seems to me that there is absolutely no filter. There's nothing between what he's feeling here and what comes out of here. It's so passionate and it's so raw and it's so intense. I don't think even Neil Young knows what he's going to play next because it just comes straight out of the heart. You can hear that on all his extended solos on things like Cortez the Killer, the end of Like a Hurricane, which has a brilliant guitar solo I love. He starts violining towards the end of it where he's bringing the note in, you know, with the volume control rather than hitting it abruptly. I find it really quite moving and emotional. But all over the Ragged Glory album, he does these wonderful extended solos. He's also a great acoustic guitar player. He has this lovely woody percussive style where you can hear the wood in the guitar and you can hear him really digging out the strings. You can hear that on probably Captain Kennedy from Hawks and Doves is a really good example. And of course, Old Man. You can hear it all over the Harvest album. At number 4, David Gilmour, one of the elegant elder statesmen of rock guitar. I think David Gilmour is the master of finding the right notes to play over a chord sequence. many times a guitarist will kind of just, when they're doing a solo, go off into their own world, just kind of aware that the band is taking care of business behind them, maybe playing a 12 bar or some kind of generic chord sequence, and they can just twiddle off doing those boxy pentatonics I was talking about earlier. Not so for David Gilmour. You can hear that he's really listened to the chord sequences, and he's really thought about maybe what the best notes to sort of bring out the beauty of that chord sequence is going to be. You can hear it on the beginning of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, all over Comfortably Numb. And also another good example is the really unusual note he comes in on the solo of the final cut on, which isn't necessarily one you think about. But, you know, clearly he's thought, you know, how can I maximize the potential of the music behind me? With David Gilmour, it's all about taste and tone and style as well. Nothing's too hurried. Nothing is rushed. It's all very, very stately and elegant. The pace of everything is absolutely perfect. And you know, and that's why he's become such an iconic and popular guitar player, because there's a real beauty in a lot of what David Gilmour brings to guitar playing. At number 3, Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck, of course, started in the Yardbirds in the 60s, and then he moved on to the Jeff Beck group with Rod Stewart and Beck, Bogart and a Piece. He's done jazz fusion with George Martin, electro jazz with Jan Hammer. He's done so many things, Jeff Beck, because he's a restless spirit. The wonderful thing about Jeff Beck is he's always looking to grow and develop as a musician. And I think more than any other guitar player on this list, he's probably the most naturally musical. You know, I love the fact that, you know, he's always looking to develop and push himself and push himself and push himself. And I think if you did a poll of 1,000 guitar players, overall Jeff Beck might come out on top. I think he's probably the guitarist's guitarist, one we all look and try to emulate. But I think he's probably the hardest guitarist on this list to emulate. We can all kind of approximate the tones and styles of other guitar players, but not so Jeff Beck, because there's so much going on. You know, he's using the tremolo arm, he's using the volume control, the tone control, there's tapping going on. And I mean, it's almost impossible to see everything he's doing. A really good example of that is watching him do Nadir, a cover of a Nitin Sawhney song that you can find on YouTube. There's a great version of it from Ronnie Scott's. But, you know, he can absolutely rock out, and he's also got this beautiful sort of touch. You can hear that on Goodbye Pork Pie Hat and so We've Ended as Lovers. A real guitar maverick. He never settled down. You know, a lot of guitarists kind of, you know, they find their style and their tone and they stick with it throughout their career. That's absolutely not what Jeff Beck has done. He's pushed himself all the time, and he must be admired and respected for that. At number 2, Eric Clapton. Very hard to do a list like this and leave Eric Clapton out. Just monumentally influential when he came onto the scene with the Yardbirds, and then particularly with the Blues Breakers album. And yes, he was very heavily influenced by Freddie King and B.B. King and Albert King, but I think it's the attack and the intensity and the rawness and the sheer volume of his playing on that album that made everybody stand up and go, wow, there's a real new kid on the block now. And of course people were starting to write, you know, Clapton is God in graffiti around London at the time. Then he moved on to Cream, where he was able to sort of improvise and extemporize for days upon end, like Cream were prone to do. But then something happened with Eric Clapton. He sort of, in the 70s, disappeared into himself. He wanted to sort of lose the guitar hero tag a little bit, and he stepped out of the limelight into the shadows and made these records where he was happy to let other players on the album step forward and take the solos. People like George Terry and Andy Fairweatherlow and Albert Lee. And when he emerged from that in the late 80s, early 90s, he was something of a different player, I think. He seemed much, much more immersed back in the blues, and his tone had got richer, and his phrasing had really tightened up and become much more impressive. And I think that when that had a lot to do with, like I said, going back into the blues, but just more comfortable with the guitar hero tag that he'd been given. And you could listen to something like From the Cradle, and you know, he is absolutely taking the lead on that record, unlike he'd done on many records for you know, 15 years before then. His acoustic guitar playing I really like. You can hear some wonderful phrases on Unplugged. He's just got a library of fantastic phrases. We can all play some Eric Clapton licks. And he's much disparaged by some people who say, oh, they preferred Peter Green in the Blues Breakers, or Clapton's tone was too thin, or his playing was too cliched. I don't buy that at all. I think Clapton's a wonderful guitar player, and I think if you're pretending you haven't been influenced by him, I think you're kidding yourself a little bit. But number one on my list is Jimmy Page. I love context. I don't like hearing guitarists just sort of prattle on the guitar for days upon end. I like having a focus and a core. And with Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page had the most wonderful platform to play guitar with. I mean, I love Led Zeppelin, and I think Jimmy Page's other very ample skills as a producer and a composer and an arranger, I think they really inform his guitar playing in a very fundamental way. Listen to something like 10 Years Gone, which by the end of that song there are guitars going off all over the place, but you wouldn't necessarily know because they're so beautifully arranged, and they're all saying something, they're all doing something, and it's very powerful. But he's also a beautiful composer. He's worked a lot with alternate tunings. Just listen to the Rain song, which is such a lovely composition. Listen to the beginning of Over the Hills and Far Away, a fantastic acoustic guitar player. He can play explosively, like you can hear on Dazed and Confused and things like that, or he can play very beautiful sort of melodic solos, like on his slide solo on What Is and What Should Never Be. I think, you know, interesting enough, he's quite a sloppy live player, Jimmy Page, but I find that quite exciting and endearing. It adds an edge, I think, to when I'm watching Led Zeppelin live, and I'm kind of, you know, almost egging him on. I'm sort of, hang in there, Jimmy. You know, you can do this, which I'm sure he doesn't need me egging him on. But I think all of those things that Jimmy Page can do are part of who he is as a musician. I think he's probably up with Jeff Beck, the most musical player on this list, but I think his musicality is different to Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck's is untethered and wild and kind of runs free, following all kinds of different styles. With Jimmy Page, there's much more of a core and a focus. It's all about making Led Zeppelin sound fantastic, and he did. They sounded amazing. And that's really why I love Jimmy Page, because all of those talents he brings are a part of his musicality. It's not just his guitar playing, it's the whole picture that he has, and I think they're all important to what he does as a guitar player. So that's my list of top 10 players. There's so many other players I'd love to have put on, but I just didn't have time for. Mick Ronson, Ritchie Blackmore, Mark Knopfler, Chuck Berry, Mike Campbell, and George Harrison. I mean, George Harrison is absolutely one of my favourite players, but I just thought that with the Beatles, it's in many ways it's the combination of all the guitars that made it so wonderful. But I did feel a little bit bad leaving him off this list. But there you go. I'm sure you don't agree with me. People are very passionate about this sort of thing. I know I am. So if you've got something to say, then please do say so in the comments below, and let's get a discussion going. But that's it. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you again very soon for another Rock Records Reviewed. Bye bye.